Hi, everyone. This is Raquel.
Hi, and this is Jennifer.
Welcome to Madness Cafe.
This is a feminist podcast where we talk about women's issues, politics, and health and wellness.
And where those issues intersect. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Madness Cafe. Today, our guest is Nicole Bedera. And let me tell you about Nicole. There's a lot of great information here, so bear with me. Nicole Bedera, Ph.D., is a sociologist and author of the book On the Wrong Side: How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. Her research broadly focuses on how our social structures contribute to survivors' trauma and make sexual violence more likely to occur in the future. Her scholarship has influenced sexual violence prevention programming across the country, including for Planned Parenthood, and her work has been featured in many popular outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, Time Magazine, and Teen Vogue. Nicole puts her work into practice as an affiliated educator at the Center for Institutional Courage and as a co-founder of Beyond Compliance Consulting. Nicole, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're very excited to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to be here.
So your book pissed me off. Just saying that right out of the gate. I had an emotional few days reading it. Tell us about you and what brought you to write this book.
Ooh, great question. So a little backstory on me. Before I became a PhD, before I got my PhD in sociology, I used to be a victim advocate working in the hospitals. So that's where you would go if you want to get a forensic exam, or people might know them as a rape kit. These exams are known to be really traumatizing, right? And some of your listeners, some of you perhaps, maybe don't need to imagine having experienced a sexual assault. And then the first thing that our criminal justice system expects you to do is put your personhood aside and turn yourself into evidence. And to say, after that violation of autonomy, I'm going to spend hours in a hospital room with a bunch of strangers looking me over naked from head to toe. And the role of a victim advocate in that space is a victim advocate is the only person who can't be subpoenaed. So if a victim has questions about what's happening to them, including things like, do I have to do this? Can I set a boundary? Or I'm under 21 and I was drinking. Can I go to jail for that? You know, all kinds of questions like that. They go to a victim advocate. Victim advocates have been found to really reduce the amount of trauma survivors experience in this setting. So it's a really important job, even though it's in a really horrible setting. And in that role, I felt strongly that it was important to have survivor advocates there, right? But a lot of the questions that survivors would ask me, we didn't have clear answers to. Questions like, why does this happen to me? Why does this keep happening to so many people? And at the time, this was a little over 10 years ago, a lot of the answers in the academic literature blame the victim. They said, well, you were drinking, well, you were out after dark, well, you brought men into your life who can't be trusted, as if we don't all have a man in our life who probably can't be trusted, right?
Like, how are we supposed to know which one?
How are you supposed to know?
Right.
The only way to find out is trial and error. The only way to find out is to get to know somebody. And we've all cut off relationships when we realize that we're surprised by who that person is, right? And I didn't like giving those answers to survivors. We didn't give those answers to survivors. We would give them a lot of caveats. We would say that the research needed to change. And so I went to graduate school to be able to do that research from a perspective of, again, with that victim advocate background, saying, I'm looking around here and this system feels pretty messed up. Feels like a big reason that this keeps happening is because there's no such thing as accountability or even true sexual assault prevention in our society. And that's what drove me to write the book eventually, but to go to research in the first place. The way I decided to study college campuses, it sort of fell into my lap when I thought about places that I was seeing really clear examples of victim blaming rhetoric, of systems that weren't working. I was on a college campus, obviously, that's where you get a PhD. It just sort of seemed perfect as a place to start, because there are a lot of people who care about college because it's college. I am not one of those people. I care about college because it's the place where the most privileged and powerful young people in our society learn how it's okay to be an adult. That's where the Brett Kavanaughs of the world, the Clarence Thomases of the world come to understand how to be above the law. And so that's where I wanted to be. And it's also the place where we teach victims what you're supposed to shrug off, what you're not supposed to care about. And that's why I decided to focus on college campuses. I don't think it is a coincidence that a few years after all of this campus advocacy, if you remember the Obama years, there was all this campus victim advocacy and this talk about college sexual assault in 2013, 2014. It wasn't that much longer around that same time, that same group of women who had pushed so hard to address campus sexual assault, they were entering the workforce. That's when Me Too really started to go viral, even though it had been around for a very long time. And so I think what happens on our college campuses is a look into the future. I think it's the canary in the coal mine. And I think everything that young adults learn, it's the cornerstone of how you know to be an adult in our society. And that's especially important when those adults are going to be so powerful.
That is perhaps one of the most brilliant things that I have heard in a long time.
Thank you. That's
Yeah,
very kind of you to say.
No,
that's a really great answer.
Maybe kind, but I meant that 100%, like really looking at it as, I forget the line that you said, but the brightest and probably most privileged of our society. It's the place where they're learning how to be people in our society. Yeah. Say the line again. It was so brilliant.
Oh, it's the most privileged and powerful people in our society, the ones who are going to be in control of the most things. And that's why, even if you're thinking about this book and you're thinking like, oh, I don't know if I care that much about college campuses, I graduated a long time ago, you'll probably see a lot of similar dysfunctions in your workplace, in your family, in your church, in whatever organizations matter to you. A lot of this stuff is not really specific to a college campus. That's just where people learn to do it.
Yeah.
College is basically like a microcosm of other organizations that you will belong to in your life. Sort of touching on what Jennifer said at the beginning. Yeah, this was a hard book to read. Not because of your writing, because your writing is amazing, by the way. It's a very readable, accessible book. You present the information in a really wonderful, just a really great way. Your writing is really good. But it's the emotion of it. And I went back and forth from, gratitude that thankfully nothing like this happened to me in college, then anger that it was happening to anybody, and then anger at the institutions. And literally, and I was telling Jennifer this before we started, that by the time I finished the book, I wanted to punch somebody in the face. And I just, it's such a powerful book. And I want to read a section from your book, kind of going back to the thought about the most privileged and powerful that'll be basically running our country and running institutions in our country. On page 8, you actually wrote, when universities gender integrated their students, faculty, and staff at best, expected women to assimilate to the structures made for men, and at worst, created new traditions that would continue to exclude women. Most obviously, gender and race integration led white men to build a fraternity system and carve out a part of campus that would still be entirely their own. It's no accident that the white men who belong to these organizations commit acts of sexual violence at the highest rate. These organizations were always intended to be safe havens for misogyny and racism, relics of the boys' club that remain firmly intact no matter how much the rest of campus changes around them. Oh my God. And okay, let me just put this out there. Okay, not all fraternities, not all frat boys, but oh my God, reading that was kind of like a punch in the chest, because as part of the Greek system, I'm part of a sorority. I saw a lot of bad behavior in college, but to see it in black and white in print like that was so eye-opening. And yeah, like I said, like a punch in the chest. So yeah.
Yeah, and you're right that it really is not all fraternities, not all Greek life. So this is actually one of my favorite like little quirks of the sexual violence data to talk about. But in general, fraternity men commit sexual assault at one of the highest rates on campus.
Mhm.
Male athletes are the group that
Mhm.
commit sexual assault at a higher rate. Studies find it's about 1 in 2 male athletes, regardless of sport. It is so much higher than we think. And for
Whoa.
fraternities, it's 1 in 3. But of those groups of fraternity men that are committing acts of sexual violence, they're actually concentrated in just the highest ranking, most prestigious fraternities. And so it's really pretty, it's not totally binary, right? I would
Mhm.
never go so far as to say this is a safe fraternity. You can trust this one
Yeah.
because it doesn't take much in that environment, and especially in these competitive male only environments for this kind of violence to take hold. But it is true that among the groups at the top, it's really ubiquitous. In
Mhm.
some cases, sexual violence is at part of hazing. And so 100% of men in some fraternities committed acts of sexual violence. As much as we want to think that this stuff has gone away, it really hasn't. It's
Mhm.
just gone a little bit more underground. And that's actually one of the things about this book that I think is pretty interesting. Even though I start by talking about the fraternity system, there's only one case in the book that it involved the fraternity and sorority system.
Mhm.
And that is because in Greek life, they've really figured out, because of how the power dynamics work and because there are often students that work in a specific office called Greek life, they really figured out how to suppress the complaints about what's going on college campuses in a way that's actually even a little bit more pernicious than the sort of mainstream Title IX office stuff that I was talking about in the book.
Oh.
In this particular case, I knew of stories of victims that had tried to come forward and they went to Greek life, and then Greek life said, oh, you shouldn't come forward. And a lot of this, I talk about this concept called empathy in the book, which is when
Yeah.
we give men empathy, excessive empathy, and at the
Mhm.
expense of women. We do it in a way that hurts women. And so there'd be a lot of these conversations about, think about his future. You might be ruining his life. Is what happened to you really that bad? Weren't you drinking? Weren't you this? Weren't you that? And it's coming from peers. It's coming from friends. And that's part of why it
Mhm.
was a little bit harder to capture in the book, is in comparison to the rest of the book where I interviewed the victims, the perpetrators, and the school administrators. These were student employees. They were never people who were recruited to participate in the study. So I had to hear about it sort of through the grapevine, but they were effectively keeping people from coming forward at all into this Title
Yeah.
IX system, which I feel a little ambivalent about, given, everything in the book about how harmful the Title IX system is to survivors. In some ways, it
Mhm.
might be a bit protective to handle it within our own communities. And I think a lot of people after reading this book will choose to do that. But I would hope that we'd be doing that for the benefit of survivors, not for the
Right.
benefit of perpetrators. And that's what's happening in the Greek system, is the
Mm.
benefit of perpetrators.
So, for our listeners who don't really know about the history of Title IX and how it came to include sexual assault, could you explain that briefly?
Yeah, so Title IX is just a single sentence. As far as laws go, it's one of the easiest ones to wrap your head around at first. And that single sentence basically says that no one can be excluded from participation or from the benefits of an education on the basis of their sex. And it's really, really vague. It's really broad. And so on paper, discrimination on the basis of gender is illegal
Mhm.
in any kind of school system. So this book is about universities, but this is also true in K through 12 schools as well. But in practice, a lot of these schools looked around and said, I mean, you didn't define what that said, though, right?
Mhm.
So what does that really mean we need to do? And so the thing that makes Title IX a little bit hard to wrap your head around is that even though it's just that single sentence, you have to look into the case law. Because what happens when a law is really vague is that its parameters will be defined in the courts. And
Right.
so 8 years after Title IX was passed was the first court case when a victim of sexual assault, a series of victims actually, it was oh my God, I'm forgetting the name.
Class
Uh,
action?
Thank you. A class action lawsuit. It was a class action lawsuit against Yale University, where
Mm.
victims who'd been sexually assaulted by their professors were making the argument that sexual violence was so rampant and sexual harassment by faculty to students was so rampant that women couldn't go to office hours because they couldn't know with certainty that that professor would not sexually proposition them, would not
Ugh.
sexually harass them, or would not punish them for refusing those sexual advances in a way that could hurt their
Mhm.
grades.
Mhm.
At the time, this court case was actually thrown out because the victims had graduated by the time it
Mm.
made it through the court system, which is one of the reasons why it's so important that our schools do something about this type of violence. Because when we go to the civil courts or the criminal courts, it takes too long and the harm to an education has already been done. But in this case, the judge said, you know, I'm going to throw out this case, but he did write a legal brief that said, this is totally reasonable to think of sexual violence and sexual assault and harassment as a form of gender discrimination, and it should be illegal on our college campuses. Schools need to do something to prevent it. They need to do something to address it when it happens. And that is the beginning, the foundation of why our schools care about sexual assault. A lot of people are surprised to hear this because they think that the reason that we care about sexual assault on campus is because there must be some law out there that says we need to protect survivors. And that's not really true. The reason we care about sexual assault on campus is because if you have been sexually assaulted, it can negatively impact your education, especially if your perpetrator is still on campus and you, for example, have to try to avoid them because nobody from the institution is looking out for you. But also, sexual assault, just the trauma of it, can take a big toll on things like memory formation, the ability to pay attention, especially if you're having difficulties with sleep. At the beginning of the book, I go through this list of all these different things that survivors experience because I think most people know that sexual violence is wrong. I don't think
Yeah.
there's anybody out there that says, oh, I think, you know, this is no big deal. But what people don't know is why it's wrong and why it's damaging. And the reason that we think sexual violence is so wrong in our society is because it can unravel the entirety of a person's life, including their education. And so that's where Title IX comes in, because the research that's come out much more recently than that has found that that judge's intuition and the plaintiff's intuition was right, which is sexual assault history is the best predictor of a woman's grades in college. It's associated with how high your GPA will be, whether or not you will drop out, what major you'll be able to complete. Sexual violence history is a very clear predictor of whether or not a woman can complete a degree in a STEM field that they originally wanted, in part because these classes have weed out. They have weed out courses, right? And so if you are dealing with the trauma of a sexual assault the semester that you're in organic chemistry, that might show up on your grades and you might have to change your major after that. Or
Yep.
something that I found in the research that another study found actually concurrently. We always love that when you're doing your work and somebody else says, I saw that too. That's really nice. But one of the things that I found and another group of researchers found too is that survivors who've experienced this kind of trauma, to get out from that harm on your GPA of that, you know, the trauma semester is what a lot of people will call it, that what you have to do is actually keep retaking classes to remove those low grades from your transcript. That's the only way, if you fail a class,
Wow.
to be able to get that class changed, especially if you're not getting supports. So if 30 survivors or anybody who knows college survivors or somebody who, you know, you might not know if they're a survivor, but you know, college student, something you should say is that there actually are a lot of programs on college campuses to be able to remove those low grades from your transcript. Contact a confidential resource on campus. It'll usually be called something like victim advocacy or the sexual assault center, something like that. So you don't have to do this, but most victims don't know that. Instead, they get stuck in a major they don't want to be in because they have to keep retaking these courses that maybe they realize their freshman year, oh, I don't want to be a history major, but I have to keep retaking these classes and now I'm running out of time on my scholarships. They get stuck in something they're not interested in. And this is just one of many, many examples of why sexual violence impacts education and why Title IX is so important.
You just brought up something that stuck out for me. You say that they should reach out to like a victim advocate, or they should XYZ they should do. When you just said that, I was like, if something had happened to me, I wouldn't know who to talk to. When I was in
Right.
college, I wouldn't have known who to go to. I remember basic stuff like workshops on campus, like, hey, use the buddy system. Don't walk across campus by yourself after dark. And here, carry your pepper spray and, you know, like stuff like that. But I honestly don't remember anybody presenting what, like, here are the steps. This is what you should do if you're assaulted and you need to reach out to somebody, or you're having trouble in a class. This is what you should do. And you actually talk about that in the book, that these students have no idea what the process is. And some of the professors didn't even know. Like,
Yeah.
oh, you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z, I think, but I don't know where to direct you to go.
It's pretty depressing, actually,
Yeah.
because when I was in college, this whole Title IX apparatus on college campuses didn't really exist yet. And so I had a similar experience to you, where I remember the dean of students, I talk about this in passing in the book, but the dean of students of my college standing on stage at first year student orientation saying, we haven't had a sexual assault on this campus in 10 years. This is the safest place you could ever be. And that was the extent of training that we got on campus sexual violence.
Mhm.
Mind you, that wasn't true.
Mhm.
And at the time the dean of students said that, he knew it wasn't true because students were trying to come forward about violence they experienced every year. And the longer I was on my alma mater's campus, which was a small liberal arts college in Salt Lake City, they were having the survivors. The longer I was there, the more horror stories I was hearing about just how bad it was, and that it
Mhm.
was sort of the Wild West back then. Schools, a lot of them had a Title IX office, but you probably thought of it more about women's sports and
Yeah.
athletics than about
Yes,
sexual
totally.
Yeah,
violence.
absolutely.
Yeah, it was a totally different world. And
Mhm.
so then you had these individual people who had no training on sexual violence, no training on what to do with survivors, just kind of making their own decisions arbitrarily about should I support this student or not. And a lot of the times students were being told things like, ooh, with the amount that you've been drinking, or the amount, if you have something like suicidal ideation, we think that that's a legal risk to the school. We actually would like you to drop out, or we would like you to remove yourself from the dorms, and we're not going to give you a refund. And so that was the state of things 10 years ago. Today,
Mhm.
very little has changed. And that's a huge indictment, because
Mhm.
now you could probably talk to any student on a college campus and they will tell you, I have to sit through a Title IX training every semester. I definitely had one in first year student orientation. That's what people say. Like, oh, I definitely
Yeah.
had one in first year student orientation. I was really overwhelmed by being a first year student. I don't remember anything from it.
Mhm.
And I guess I see some posters around sometimes. And then, some schools will require like an online module that everybody just clicks through and nobody even bothers reading, right?
Yeah.
What that means is that all of this training, and the same thing happens for faculty, all of these professors who didn't know what to do in the book, they'd all been trained about what to do, but they
Oh God.
still don't know. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that even though campus sexual violence is really common, we still tend to underestimate how much it's affecting students in a single semester. So even really well-intentioned professors will come to me and say, I really appreciate your work. Do you have any advice? I think I might have a student who's a survivor in my class someday. And I always
Mhm.
reply with, you have students who are survivors in your class every semester. Right
Mhm.
now, every
Mhm.
semester, the rates of violence are so high, it is absolutely impossible that you don't have a single student who's experienced some kind of violence in their lifetime. You have one every semester. You probably have a lot every semester. And when you're thinking about that worst case scenario where a survivor has to come to you for help, it's probably because they're perpetrators in the same class. And that's really the extent of it. So
Yeah.
a lot of people on campus, a lot of faculty, a lot of administrators are really thinking about this out there problem that might affect me someday, and aren't I so good for being preventative and like thinking about it in advance, when actually everybody on campus is really late to this conversation. So that's one issue. And I think the other issue is just the trainings are really bad. The reality is that there aren't very many trainings that do good. Most sexual harassment trainings actually increase sexual harassment on college campuses. All of this training that's happening on our campuses, what it primarily does for perpetrators, and this is what I found in my research, and others have found too, is it teaches them how to sort of skirt the system,
Mm.
how to walk right up to the line, how to rationalize their behavior in a way
Yeah.
that won't upset other people and will go undetected. There's some more insidious stuff that happens if they get more deeply involved in the system, which is very much in the book. But
Yeah.
the idea that these trainings are helping is not true. At best, they're doing nothing. At worst, they're causing more harm. And the reality is that, yeah, if you ask the average student, where should you go? They don't know the answer to that question. And I would say that the answer that they're getting most of the time, which is go to Title IX, is the wrong answer from the perspective of what's best for survivors.
Okay.
Because the Title IX office, especially under the Biden administration, is investigating cases based off of institutional interests. And a lot of things can fly out of the control of a survivor once you walk into a
Mhm.
Title IX office. What
Mhm.
I would say, and I said this before, and I'm going to say it again, if they take one thing from this conversation, the place you should go on campus is a confidential victim advocate, because victim advocates, they cannot start an investigation against your will or without your consent.
Okay.
They can't be subpoenaed to testify if you're ever involved in a legal case. It's a place where if you don't know what you want yet, because you
Mhm.
don't know what the options are, that's where you should go. You should go to
Okay.
that place where you can ask whatever question you need to and not have to worry about what might happen as the result of asking those questions.
And I'm
Okay.
sure every victim meets that criteria.
Yeah.
Every victim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I really cared about these issues when I was a college student. I was involved in my first research study I conducted as an undergraduate. I was involved in a bunch of feminist, sort of take back the night kind of stuff as a student. And I didn't learn what to do when you were sexually
Yeah.
assaulted until I
Right.
trained as a professional to be a victim
Right.
advocate. It was the first time
Yep.
I learned the answer to that question. Because the reality is there actually are a lot of options. There are a lot of different places that you can go and a lot of ways that you can handle what happened to you. Some are more formal than others.
Mm.
Some are better resourced than others. Some are more focused on victims. Some are more focused on perpetrators. But yeah, the question of what do you want and how can we get it to you? I don't think it's something that anybody's prepared for.
Are there victim advocates at all colleges and universities? Great.
No, and I think that's one of the trickiest things is
Okay.
victim advocacy offices became really common at large institutions and public institutions, but the Trump administration has really allowed schools to kind of do whatever they want around Title IX, and the Biden administration has stayed that course. And
Hmm.
so we're seeing, like so many other issues in our country right now, this big disparity, where in the state of California, they're legally required. In the
Yeah.
state of California, every public school has a victim advocate, and that victim advocate is actually employed by the state, not by the school. So there's no conflict of interest. I actually testified on behalf of this bill because I think it is such a good idea. If you make it
Yeah.
to the end of the book, you'll see me talk
Yep.
about this because it is so important that our victim
Hmm.
advocates are confidential and independent. So if you're going to school in California, you probably can get some good information, and your school
Yeah.
might not handle things well, but you won't be alone in handling that. But
Hmm.
states like Georgia have really been pulling back on Title IX, have really been pulling back on resources available to students. So we're seeing that same split that where you go to school, your average college student is
Yeah.
thinking about what city do I want to live in?
Yep.
Where do I like the weather? Where is there a
Hmm.
major that I'm interested in? I want to do this really specific major. It's only offered at 10 schools. They're not thinking about what happens if I'm sexually assaulted? What happens if I need an abortion? And
Yep.
now that's something that our students will really have to contend with once they get to campus, because these are supposed to be national rights. Title IX is
Hmm.
a federal law,
Hmm.
but what Title IX means is changing a lot from state to state.
Do schools in states that still have access to abortion have better protections for sexual violence survivors on campus?
I want to answer that with a yes and no.
Yeah, that's
Because
fair. That's fair.
So we'll start with the yes. The yes is that there are a cluster of states that the state legislators have passed more laws to
Hmm.
have more rules about what schools have to do. So things like the
Okay.
states of California, Illinois, and New York led the way with requiring an affirmative consent policy and dictating what that affirmative consent policy has to be for campus sexual assault. There are some states, I can think of some states that have more robust laws around taking guns away from perpetrators or whether or not you're allowed to have guns on campus at all. The
Okay.
university I was at allowed guns in dorms. And so the state
Wow.
laws about whether or not you're allowed to have your gun in your dorm and when they're taken away, there were actually some discussions in the state legislature about that issue on college campuses while I was in the field. I don't get into it in the book,
Hmm.
but yeah, that stuff matters. That
Yeah.
matters a lot. But the no part of how it isn't different is most universities belong to the same professional organization to get their
Okay.
Title IX materials. And I talk about it again, sort of quickly in passing
Hmm.
in the book, but the Association of Title IX Administrators, ATICSA, if you want to
Oh,
look
I
it
don't
up.
like them.
I don't like them either.
Hmm.
And for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of them is that when Atixa was founded, they didn't have any experts in sexual violence on their team. They were just people who were already connected to college campuses because they were connected to another group. The same founders from this first group founded Atixa, and that group is called TNG. You've probably never heard of TNG, but TNG does risk assessment for threats of violence, including mass shootings on college
Oh, yeah.
campuses.
Hmm.
Mass shootings or suicide threats, anything where a student poses a harm to themselves or others.
Okay.
TNG really was already all throughout this market on college campuses doing stuff that, for the most part, we never hear about. And when the Obama administration got interested in Title IX and started putting more requirements on what schools need to do around Title IX, in the past, there were these Title IX laws. Every few presidential administrations, someone would nudge schools and remind them, hey, you're breaking the law. Do you want to follow the law? And that was as far as it went. But the Obama administration put together a task force. They sent the same memo and it just hit a different way. For whatever reason, it hit a different way. And then they
Mhm.
put together a task force, they put together some clear and comprehensive guidelines that were really unlike anything that had happened before that. And in that moment, a lot of schools scrambled. They said, we don't even have a Title IX office for sexual assault survivors. We're supposed to have a grievance process that's required by law. We don't have one. What are we
Mhm.
going to do? And so this group that was already on college campuses put together a bunch of materials, but they didn't consult any experts on sexual violence. And so the materials they put together in many states would actually be illegal. For example, in the state of California, they don't use an affirmative consent standard, so it would be illegal.
Oh.
But nobody really knows. It's one of those things that on paper, the policies and procedures that have been passed by students or by state legislatures out in the open are really different than how investigators are actually evaluating these cases with their own
Mhm.
internal documents. And those documents are pretty much coming from the same place. They're coming from this group at TICSA, which is part of why after I left the field and once, the first draft of the book was finished, I started my own consulting practice to try to work with schools that want to do better, or any other organization too. But to say we actually are a group of experts on sexual
Mhm.
violence and campus sexual violence in particular. We know these laws better than anybody else. And it's one of the things that if you're listening to this and you're in school or you have a child who's in school, especially K through 12 schools, the Biden administration is bringing this Title IX system to K through 12 schools in a way that no
Oh,
other
good.
administration has. Yeah, it's good and bad, right? Because the system is a
Uh-huh.
little broken. But
Yeah.
there is an opportunity here for our K through 12 schools to do better. And so that's one of the groups that we're working with the most is concerned parent groups that really want to make sure that whatever their school district is doing for Title IX is appropriate. And so that's something that you can do right now is to say we don't want TICSA to continue expanding. Because on paper, a lot of the policies and procedures that these universities have that were passed by students and student government, they
Mhm.
look pretty good. And if
Right.
they functioned as written, we'd be in a much better system. The problem
Mhm.
is these internal documents and how these cases are handled behind all these cloaks of confidentiality and privacy that nobody gets to see inside of. I'm the one who got to see inside of those, and that's why I feel so confident that the problem is those documents.
Let's talk about this concept of affirmative consent. What does that mean?
Mm.
So affirmative consent, there are a lot of different versions of it, but what it basically boils down to is in the past and in our legal code for our criminal courts, there is a requirement that a victim who is trying to communicate that they're being sexually assaulted has to communicate that in some way. Our criminal code really looks for evidence of no, that there was no consent or that consent was revoked. One of the issues with that way of managing sexual violence is that the most common reaction to sexual assault is the freeze response. So,
Mhm.
it's out, people know about it now, but when your body is responding to a traumatic event, it can either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. I talk a lot about fawning in the book, is the one that
Mhm.
a lot of people don't know about yet. But freeze is the most common. So when you freeze, a lot of victims describe it as losing the ability to control their bodies at all. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to say no, but I couldn't. I wanted to fight and run away, but I couldn't. I just felt stuck. And a lot of victims will actually say, they'll blame themselves for that. They'll say, it
Yeah.
must be that I was okay with it, or it must be that I had had too much to drink. I'd had more than I thought. I thought I only had a glass of wine, but I couldn't move, so I must have been incapacitated from alcohol. But it's a trauma response. It's the
Mhm.
freeze response. And so if our criminal code requires victims to say no, and in different states, the laws are very different. So, everything I'm saying, it totally depends on where you live. We don't
Right.
have federal laws around what the definition of sexual assault should be. It's all on a state by state basis. A lot of states require that no. And so feminists said that doesn't make sense because no means no, obviously, but there's also a lot of other stuff that isn't yes. And so affirmative consent is that framework of only yes means yes. And that's how it's supposed to work, is that it's on your responsibility as someone who's engaging in sex with another person to make sure that you have a yes, not to use the absence of a no as a reason to do whatever you want to them. And
Mhm.
that's what it really boils down to. It's been contorted quite a bit on college campuses into something that I would say is actually worse than a no means no approach, but that's sort of a separate issue, separate
Mhm.
question.
In that vein, I wanna bring up something that we bring up every once in a while. We did an episode, we were talking about consent, and we learned about the acronym FRIES, FRIES, and it stands for freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. I feel that if that were taught in K through 12, if it were taught in college, if it were taught in pretty much everywhere, that I think that that would be pretty helpful to people.
I mean, that brings up a really interesting point. When I first heard that phrase acronym, I thought enthusiastic. Wow, what a difference that would make if everyone was
Right.
enthusiastic about what was going on, right? Instead of the no means no, but no means maybe I can talk you into it if I pressure you a little bit, or I
Yeah.
give you a little more to drink, or whatever. It really brings up for me, especially for people in adolescence, especially for young men and young women who are kind of confused about what they even want, how ambiguous or confusing this could be. And a big point in your book is that there's been a lot of protection for boys, or I shouldn't say boys, perpetrators around that. And maybe a lot of abandonment of the person who experienced the sexual assault around that. Could you speak on that a little bit? Do we need to protect perpetrators?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I think you're okay to say boys here, because one of the findings of the book is that when the perpetrators, or rather we should say the people who were accused, because a lot of them were
Okay.
not perpetrators, they were actually victims in retaliatory complaints, which is what happens when a perpetrator, to try to muddy the waters,
Yeah.
says, you might have heard about this acronym of DARVO. So a
Mm-mm.
DARVO response, which stands for, it's what perpetrators often do when they're confronted with accusations against them. And
Mm-hmm.
it stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender.
Oh,
And so
yeah,
they
I've
deny that.
felt that.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's familiar to a lot of us that what they'll do is deny that they did something, deny that they did anything, or deny that it was wrong. A lot of the time they'll say, yeah, I did it, but it was fine. And here's why it's
Right.
fine, right? Then they attack the victim, usually their credibility. They'll say something negative about them. And then they reverse victim and offender and say, well, actually, if that's your definition of violence, then wasn't she actually violent to me? That's part of why in this case I hesitate to say perpetrators, say when women are accused they don't get the same kind of protection, because a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
time the women are not perpetrators, the women are victims experiencing a DARVO response. But it is true that even in cases where women had been violent, again usually in self-defense,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't get these same kind of protections. So first I want to say I think you're fine to say boys. In terms of the protection that they need, I think there was this funny thing that kept happening in my interviews with administrators where they would keep saying to me, everybody is on the victim's side. Everybody knows sexual assault is wrong. Doesn't the perpetrator deserve someone? And on its
No.
face, you
Sorry.
think, one person, sure, right? But on its face, sure, they deserve one person who can like answer their questions about the Title IX process, right? Like some really basic stuff. But
Fine.
in reality, though, almost everybody is thinking that they're the one.
Mm-hmm.
Almost everybody is rushing to be that one person who's going to help a perpetrator. And so what happens is the victim has no one. Everyone thinks the victim has all the support in the world and they have no one. And the
Yeah.
perpetrator has everyone. I think our concerns about protecting perpetrators are really in the wrong place. Perpetrators have more support than we can even imagine. Sexual violence, even though we say it's sort of the worst thing that can happen to somebody in our society, we're really forgiving. The research is pretty clear. There's this one study that just lives rent-free in my brain. And one of the things that they did in this study is it's something called an audit study. So that's when the researchers will send like application materials for a job, fake
Mm-hmm.
application materials for a job.
Mm.
And they'll be exactly the same, but they change the name and then one detail on the CV. And then they see how
Yep.
much money do you want to give this person? Do you want to hire them? And so this is one of those types of studies. And the thing that they changed was the names and genders of the people applying for jobs, and then also included a little vignette that said either that they had been accused of sexual assault in their last position or sexual harassment in their last position, or they had been an accuser and that they had accused someone
Mm.
else of
Mm-hmm.
sexual assault or harassment in their last position. What do you know? It was easier for the perpetrator to get a job and to get a higher salary than the victim.
Yeah.
Even when that's basically all the information you know about them, there was this sense of, I have to give them a chance, nobody else will. And so we've really gone too far. And I don't think we've ever
Mm-hmm.
not been too far. This is a patriarchal society, right?
I think it's
Yeah.
more than that, though. I think it's also they don't want to hire a troublemaker. They don't want to hire an accuser. They don't want
Right.
to hire
Yeah.
somebody who is willing to stand up for themselves and say, this happened to me, because they don't believe women. They believe that person's trying to get a promotion, or that person's trying to, I don't know.
That's a good point, Jennifer. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
I'd even take it a step further than that and say sometimes they do believe the victim, and they also know they've done something wrong, and they don't want somebody sniffing around that. And so that's something that came up
Yes.
over and over again. I think in the sort of post Me Too, with a lot of organizations trying to decide, should we change our policies? Should we change our practices? I've seen even feminist organizations fall apart when they're trying to define, for example, what kind of behavior, if we find out about it, will we remove someone from our, professional organization, or will we say that they can't get an award? We should have higher standards for awards than membership. So what are the things that we don't accept? And the reality is, when you start thinking about things that are considered sexual violence, exploitation, abuses of power, a lot of people engage in these violent practices themselves, a way higher number than we think. And so they're thinking about themselves and saying, I don't want what I've done to come out because I know I've done something. And I just want to say that if
Wow.
you're listening to this and you're thinking, wow, that might be me, and you're thinking about that one time you did something that was a little wrong, that's not what I'm talking about. But that is how still people will defend themselves and say, quote unquote, I don't want to be canceled over
Yeah.
something really small. But that's not happening. That's not a legitimate fear. And it's something we should all try to let go of. And we should try to not rush to the side of the perpetrator. In my consulting practice, I have a co-founder, and my co-founder is also a Title IX researcher. And she did, for her dissertation work, she interviewed a bunch of Title IX coordinators about their psychological responses to doing this type of work. And
Mhm.
one of the things that she found was that people are much more comfortable associating themselves with a perpetrator than a victim. Because if you associate yourself with a victim, a lot of people will have to realize, this could happen to me. Our society is unequal. It is violent. It's
Oh my
scary to
God.
empathize with the victim. It might bring up their own past victimization experiences that they don't want to think about. But the perpetrator isn't bringing up any of that for you. The perpetrator, to associate with the perpetrator, all you have to do is tell yourself it's not that bad, actually. Things are actually okay. And for a lot of people, that feels relieving to say, oh, the sexual violence problem is not as bad as we think it is. Isn't that a nice thing to think? That's where most people will naturally fall. It's not the right
Mhm.
thing to do, and we have to protect against it. But there's a reason that I co-founded a consulting practice with Jackie, which is,
Mhm.
that's a really important insight to say, that sometimes doing the right thing feels wrong in the moment. And that's really what's happening with this protection of perpetrators too. We like to think of it as, oh, I would never take the side of a perpetrator because I trust women, I protect women, I know that it's wrong, and I would do the right thing. But actually, the process of holding a perpetrator accountable, it mostly makes people feel guilty, because there's this sense of, I'm ruining a life. There's this
Oh God. Yeah.
empathy that's given to the other person. And one of the things I think all of us can do in these situations that's really helpful is to just give ourselves a reality check. In the book, I call these fantasies of what can happen to perpetrators, I call them accumulated fantasies of disaster,
Mm.
where anything that could potentially, if you can imagine that somebody might think rape is wrong, you can picture all these bad things that can happen to these men, but that's not the empirical reality. In reality, using the example of a college campus or a
Mhm.
workplace, I think is another great example. We know that people have no problem hiring men who've committed acts of violence.
Yeah.
We know that. The research
Mhm.
is so clear. If you say, we don't want to have this perpetrator on this campus anymore because the victim can't walk through campus freely and has to be looking over her shoulder, the only stakes here is that they have to go to another school. That's it. And remembering that can alleviate some of those feelings of guilt, that pull of empathy that lives in all of
Mhm.
us, to say, actually, if he just had to transfer, that is not the biggest deal. And I actually think that's one of the most powerful parts of this book,
Yeah.
is that because I interviewed the victims, the perpetrators, and the administrators, I actually did get to see what actually happens to perpetrators. Does this affect them in any way at all? And I think going into the field, I was prepared to say, like, okay, most of them are getting away with it. Most of them are
Mhm.
either getting
Yeah.
a finding that is, insufficient evidence, there's nothing the school wants to do about it, or they graduated, so the school's saying it's too late. I was prepared for that. What I
Yeah.
wasn't prepared for was how powerful the process made them feel, how much many of them enjoyed it, and that the Title IX system or the courts was a reason to be able to come face to face with a victim who was trying desperately to escape them. And now
Mhm.
they're being forced into being in the same place again, which, we see in cases like, I did a lot of press around the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial.
Ah.
And people would say to me, very well-intentioned, very, people who think domestic violence is wrong, right? Saying, why would he do this? Why would he sue her this way? It's making him look so bad. And my response was always, this is everything that a perpetrator would ever want, is they
Mm-hmm.
can use the full force of the legal system to force a victim who got away from them to sit in a room with them for over
Mm-hmm.
a month, and they can say whatever they want. They can do things to re-traumatize that person, to bring all the violence back to the surface. And in the end, they usually come out on top of the process too. There's no negative consequences. And that's what's happening to our perpetrators in the Title IX system too, is they're enjoying this in a way that
Jesus.
I was really surprised by. I think it's understandable that so many of us don't know that because
Yeah.
part of what perpetrators do, again, if we think about that DARVO response, is they reverse victim and offender. They make us feel bad for them. And that, by
Yeah.
the way, is how they were able to be violent towards their victims too, is through
Yeah.
coercion, through manipulation, through making them, making you feel like, I want to protect you, I want to take care of you, I want to put you ahead of myself, is a big fundamental part about how gender-based violence works. And it happens to us as bystanders too. And so we have to
Mm-hmm.
protect ourselves against that and not worry so much about what happens to these men. I know a lot of people, when they read this book, they're going to say, this is such an injustice that the one perpetrator that year that I spent at this university, the one perpetrator who's expelled, just went to a school down the street, didn't even
Yeah.
have to move apartments, didn't have an educational interruption while his victim had been out of school for 2 years
Mm-hmm.
during the investigation. It is an injustice.
It
Yeah.
is.
But I think the other way that we can interpret that, which doesn't take away from the injustice, is to say, wow, we do not have to worry about these men. They are more than well taken care of. And I can focus my efforts on worrying
Well,
about the victim.
Yeah.
Brock Turner, Brent
Yeah.
Kavanaugh, they're doing
Yep.
fine.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
are doing
They're
fine.
Clarence
doing
Thomas.
Clarence Thomas, they're doing fine.
They're
Yep.
doing
Yeah.
fine. As part of the research for the book, I looked up what happened to a lot of famous college perpetrators. There's a page count. There's a lot of research that went into the book that doesn't make it into the book, right? And so again, it's
Sure.
like a passing reference. But everyone I looked up had a pretty ordinary job. They all
Yeah.
seem just fine. Many
Yeah.
of them are publicly married. Many of them were in very fancy jobs, working on Wall Street, working as lawyers, making a ton of
Supreme
money.
Court justices.
Supreme Court
Making
justices.
laws for the rest of us.
Great.
Positions of power.
Right. And that's a crucial thing. If you read this book, and I hope you do, and then you say, how did it get this way? There are lots of other really great books that get into these issues and a bunch of other contexts too, including this book, Code of Silence by Lise Olson is another good one that gets into how commonly judges are
Oh.
perpetrators of sexual violence and harassment. And so these are the people who are shaping our laws. And
Yeah.
again, a lot more of them are perpetrating than we expect. I think
Mm-hmm.
that was one of the other things that I found the most shocking is that within the Title IX system, I was prepared for administrators who were, doing their best, but their best wasn't good enough. I was surprised by how many of the administrators, either this was just a job to them and they did not care at all, and then they would move on very quickly. I looked up the other day, the book is coming out. By the time you hear this, the book is out. And so I started to think, one of the questions I get a lot is, how do you think the school is going to respond? And I had this moment of, how many of them are even there? And so I looked up
Mm.
all of the offices I studied, and there is one person left. A couple of them have been promoted into upper level administration at the university, but for the most part, everyone is gone. Some work in incredibly powerful positions in our society now. And
Oh.
this really was just a stepping stone for them, a
Yeah.
career move so that they could get onto something bigger and better. And so they're turning survivors' lives upside down and
And
enabling
they don't
violence on
care.
campus. Yeah, they don't care. They'll be gone in a couple of years. So that's one of the things I took away that was really shocking. And the other thing that I was surprised by was just how much sexual harassment was being perpetrated within the Title IX office and
Mm-hmm.
within the Dean of Students office, not within the victim advocacy office. The victim advocates were actually very often the victims of this harassment from the other two offices. But for some of the people who did stick around and who are still on this campus, they were some of the people that other people had quit because of their behavior,
Oh
because of
God.
the types of comments they would make, because of the types of harassment they were experiencing. It really is true that I get into the book about how there were all of these protections in Title
Yeah.
IX hiring to make sure that survivors weren't getting hired,
Yeah.
because there was this sense of, they'll be biased, they'll take the side of the victim. That's not fair. There were no protections to make sure perpetrators weren't getting hired. The school wasn't seeking them out either. They weren't
Mm-hmm.
looking for perpetrators, but if you're protecting against having victims in the office, and you're not protecting against having perpetrators in the office, it can't be surprising when you end up with more perpetrators than victims working within these Title IX offices. And we would
Right.
hope it's the other way, that we wouldn't see having experience with gender discrimination as something that makes you biased, but rather something that makes you experienced, that you've
Mm-hmm.
seen the inside of these systems from your own personal experiences. And then as an administrator, that should be a good thing. And that's not the way, at least this school felt about it.
Right. So, okay,
So,
so I'm sorry, just really quick. Going back to the whole empathy thing,
Mhm.
I really want you to talk a little bit about the idea about false allegations.
Yeah.
yes.
Can you get into that? I mean, just as a side note, for people who listen to the show and watched on YouTube, I am a Black woman. False allegations are a totally different animal against Black men that can lead to their death. I'm taking that, purposely taking that out of the equation. But in this situation, can you talk about false allegations and why false allegations really are not as rampant as we maybe think that they are?
As Brent
What?
Kavanaugh would like you to believe.
As Brett Kavanaugh
Exactly.
wants you to believe. Well,
Yeah.
I actually want to take the false allegations against Black men and put them back on the table because they're a really
Okay.
important part of this
Okay.
conversation.
Okay.
Because for the most part, false allegations are rare in general,
Okay.
including false allegations against Black men, because the primary victims are Black women, right? False allegations against Black men are primarily made by white women or by criminal justice entities that are
Mhm.
interested in policing a specific Black man,
Yeah.
regardless of what else. And so, if we think of examples like the Central Park Five, right?
Right.
A sexual assault did occur, and it was the police who put that sexual assault on the wrong people
Mhm.
with knowledge, with intention, right?
Right. Right.
This system, it's interesting how much it came up when talking to Title IX administrators because these false allegations are real.
Mhm.
They're legitimate. Most people know they're legitimate.
Mhm.
You won't hear a lot of people saying it's never happened, absolutely never, right?
Right.
But then the way that they mobilize this history of false allegations against Black men and lynching against Black men
Yeah.
is to protect white men, is to
Hmm.
say false allegations have happened.
Oh,
And
that
so you
makes total
can't deny
sense.
that it's happened, but then the case you're talking about, there is not a Black man present on these
Right.
college campuses, right? Or if there is
Mhm.
a Black man present, he's often someone who is high profile, someone who is an athlete,
Mhm.
Clarence
someone,
Thomas.
right? Someone who has a lot of power, someone who's close to the institution. I mean, I was at a predominantly white institution, so in this school in particular, and a lot of our schools as well, there aren't that many Black men on campus. It's just the reality of things,
Mhm.
right? That among students of color on campus, most are women. There are
Mhm.
not that many Black men on campus. And so it raised an alarm bell to me to hear school administrators saying over and over and over that we need to protect Black men when I think there was one perpetrator all year who was investigated who wasn't a white man. They're using this very real thing of false allegations against Black men, which again, there are a lot of different caveats about how that happens. And then they're protecting white men through it. And
Damn it.
so, and it's worth noting that, I get into this again in passing in the book. I hope people are enjoying listening to this because it really is like the Easter eggs of like, this was here and I didn't have time to get into it. And this is here and I didn't have time to get into it. But one of the things that these school administrators who manage Title IX on most college campuses also manage race discrimination complaints. And so
God
they
damn it.
use, yes. And so they use this trope of the Black male perpetrator and the white woman victim to be
Mhm.
able to not investigate discrimination on either side, to say when it's women who are coming forward about sexual abuse, regardless of race, including women of color, they're told we have to take false allegations seriously because that's part of our racial equity project. And then when men of color are coming forward and saying, I have experienced race discrimination on this campus or racial harassment on this campus, they say, well, white women have some really legitimate concerns about violence on this campus. And so it would sort of make sense that they might overreact in a situation like this. And so they're
Oh my
talking out of both
God.
sides of their mouth. And so it
Oh my
really is
God.
about exactly what you're talking about. Now, let's talk about what the realities are of false allegations, because it's really, really far from what this institutional picture is. false allegations made to the criminal justice system primarily happen a few different ways. One is the one we've already talked about, which is largely police departments being the ones to take sexual assault cases they haven't solved and apply them to men of color, specifically Black and brown men. And part of how that happens is the way false allegations are made by women. When women make false allegations, they very rarely name a perpetrator. And the reason that they make false allegations is because they are stuck in a structural constraint. So, for example, one of the groups most likely to make false allegations, and I want to say very clearly, it's still incredibly rare. It's still incredibly rare, but it's groups like teenagers who become pregnant from a consensual encounter and their parents file a police report on their behalf against their will that may or may not involve the person, or the teenager may be trying to protect a male partner that it was consensual with, so they won't tell their parents the identity of the father. And instead they say, oh, it was a sexual assault, because they worry about violence that may be focused on, this teenage boy that they've had a consensual sexual relationship with. This is a really different picture of a false allegation than you probably thought of in the past, which is about taking men down and doing bad things to men. This is actually women a lot of the time trying to keep men out of trouble.
Got it.
Trying to keep men and boys out of trouble. The other type of false allegation that's the most common is it's made by people with some kind of mental illness that leads to a delusional state. And I want to say too, that's a group that's also at very high risk for sexual violence. And a lot of the allegations that they make are very real, and mostly they are not taken seriously. But I did see a case of this when I worked in the hospitals. It was someone who really did firmly believe that every time he fell asleep, he was being sexually assaulted, even if he only fell asleep for a minute. It's just, not feasible. But the way I felt about that as an advocate was that delusion probably comes from a sexual assault.
Got it.
And so to even call that a false allegation doesn't feel like the whole picture. The exact thing they're saying might not be true, but it is based in, I would anticipate, something very real. And this is how they're processing the trauma from something that really happened. So this picture of false allegations, it just looks really different than what people typically think of. And even some of the other false allegations that we think of with white women, calling the police on Black men, they often talk about a threat of violence, right? And so that too, if you're looking for the red flags of, is this real? Is it not? Researchers can tell these things apart, because the threat of violence is not a crime, actually, right? And so when the police respond to that in a way that is violent, that is acting on the behalf of, white supremacy, that's really different than how they respond when even white women call the police about a real sexual assault, regardless of the race of perpetrator, right? So that's sort of the empirical realities of false allegations in the criminal justice system. On college campuses, we don't know much about them. What we do know is they're probably really different, because you're not going to get in trouble from, there are no children for the most part on college campuses. Almost everybody's over the age of 18. So all those cases involving parents are gone. Universities discriminate against people with severe mental illness, so there aren't very many people in that group. We know false allegations are pretty rare on college campuses. There's reason to believe it's even rarer than in the criminal justice system, because you don't have people who are trapped in society where they have no other way out. Things like to be able to get an abortion, right? A lot of states now require that you've been sexually assaulted to be able to access abortion care. That's the kind of thing that sort of predictably could trap someone into saying what they have to say to get the thing they need. But on college campuses, the types of false allegations are most common are the ones we already talked about, which are those retaliatory complaints. The people who are making most false allegations on college campuses are perpetrators who are trying to muddy the waters so that they can either retaliate against the victim for coming forward, the sense of, if I'm going down, you're going down with me,
Right.
or to try to convince the victim to say, I'll drop my case if you drop yours, or just to confuse the administrators and hope that they come out on top. And it's really effective. These retaliatory complaints are on the rise. There was a report from an organization called Know Your Nine that found that about 1 in 10 survivors who come forward face this kind of false retaliatory complaint. So if you're concerned about false allegations on college campuses, again, you should be concerned about supporting survivors, mostly women, coming forward, women and other gender marginalized people coming forward. It's really a very different picture than people think.
So where is the hope in all of this? Where's the
Yes, please.
give us something that, because we're going over time. So give us something to end on that's like, yeah.
Well, I think the hope for me has been talking to survivors who, when I first met them, they were in the throes of it. And they
Mhm,
were going through the formal system and doing the things that on paper they were supposed to do by going through Title IX or whatever it was, and then being really harmed through that
mhm,
system. And we didn't talk about that much today. And so it's something that, like, if you're thinking about reading the book, that's like a really big part of it, is hearing what this happened from the survivor's perspective. I think
yeah,
the stuff on perpetrators is like the new, intellectual contribution of this book. Stuff on survivors has been out there for a long time. Survivors have been generously telling their stories for a really long time, but that's a big part of the book. And so it's really important to read. But when I met them, they were having a really, really tough time.
yeah,
And since the book has come out, quite a few have reached out to just update me on their lives, which I really appreciate. And a lot of them told stories of the types of things that helped, and the types of things that helped them feel like they got their life back on track, albeit
good,
different than it ever would have been otherwise, and to feel like they were getting some control and autonomy in their lives. And a lot of them were really simple. That's one of the things, again, why we started the consulting practice, is because the solutions victims are looking for, they're not looking for anything wild. Survivors are looking for things like, I enrolled in a class that I need to take to graduate, and my perpetrator is also in that class. Can my perpetrator not take that class? And
yeah,
can I take this class? Can we make
mhm,
that happen? It's a really, really simple list of asks. It's things like, my trauma isn't getting in the way of how well I'm sleeping, and I have a class at 8 in the morning, and I've already missed a couple. I'm caught up on my assignments, but I'm now at risk of, I can't get an A in this class because my attendance is so poor. And so
yeah,
survivors are looking for things like some flexibility from instructors to say, you know what, I'm just going to waive the attendance requirement. That makes a lot of sense. And if you are an instructor listening to this, I want to say that this is just something that you can do immediately. It's just put more flexibility into your courses. I actually put together a series of resources and guides about how to do this. If you go to my website, which is just my name, NicoleBedera.com, there's a resources tab, use it. But the things that survivors need are really simple, and we can actually
yeah,
give them to them. One of the things I was stunned by when I was doing the research, the big literature review that comes after data collection is done, and you think, wow, there's so much more I wish that I'd known before I entered the field. I'm going to go and read a ton. And it was 2020, so I had lots of time to read. And one of the things that I found once I had more of the search terms and the way survivors talked about it is that there's an entire body of literature from feminists in the 80s where they already answered a lot of these questions. We do not have to reinvent the wheel. People have been doing this work for a very long time. We do know how
yeah,
to support survivors. The issue is that the people who've been given authority
yeah,
on this topic are not interested in that. They're interested in, what do we do with the perpetrator? And
mhm,
we need to be interested on, what do we do with the survivor? And then the answers are very, very simple. They're very simple. For example, like one of the clients that we work with the most in the consulting practice is, we work with a lot of classes where your traditional, do you need an extension as a survivor, won't work because they have to physically touch each other during class. So things
mhm,
like theater departments, nursing departments, medical schools, places like that, where so much of the learning experience is hands-on. It's participating in a thing with your classmates. And yeah, you might be physically touching as part of that. And the things that survivors have wanted in those cases are really simple. They're things like being able to choose their partner. They're things like
wow,
being able to have a little bit of, to be able to go to a professor and say, a theater department, and say, hey, the way you cast this show, can I look at that before it's public to make sure I'm not in a role where my perpetrator and I are physically touching? Or can we have multiple different shows this semester? We've been able to solve every problem we've come up against. The issue, though, is all this resistance of people not wanting to change the status quo, or
yeah,
thinking that it's unfair to the perpetrator. And that's why one of the big things I talk about in the book is this difference between punishment and consequences.
yeah,
Sexual violence always has consequences, and making sure those consequences are borne by the perpetrator instead of the victim is not punishment. And we need to get comfortable with it. And
mhm,
once we're comfortable with it, I think we could change a lot of things really quickly. A lot of people, after hearing about this work, they say, are you just so depressed now? Are you
yeah,
just So do you feel like this problem is way too big and complicated to solve? And I feel really strongly it isn't. The thing that's frustrating is that we know how to end sexual violence. We really do.
Yeah.
We're just unwilling to do it. But if we carve out one safe haven at a time, there are places already without sexual violence. They're not our
Yeah.
college campuses, but there are lots of other places, lots of people who have safe work experiences, safe family experiences, and we can replicate that in a big way.
That's huge. And yes, that is the big piece of hope that I think
We need.
we need, is that there are things that can be done. We can fix this. Yes, it's big, but we can fix this. One question that I have, what advice can we give to people on what to do if something happens to them? What do they do?
Well, I've already answered a piece of this question in an essay that I will link to you so you can put it in the show notes.
Okay, yes, please.
About advice about how to talk about college sexual assault with your daughter. It is the number one question I'm asked. That's things like don't victim blame. Try to
Yes.
think about prevention in your own household. We always think about prevention as like going out there and convincing other
Yeah.
people to think something differently. It works better when we look at ourselves and say, what can we do differently to make this feel abnormal? One of the reasons that I think a lot of victims are taken off guard and are so vulnerable at this age is because we treat children with just reckless disregard for their autonomy and personhood.
Mhm.
And so this idea,
Yes, we
yeah,
do.
this idea
Oh,
of,
yes.
yes, yeah, this idea of you're in an argument with your father, so you better stay there and have that argument with him. You're not allowed to storm out. You're not allowed to swear at him. You're not allowed to resist,
And hug
right?
him afterwards.
And hug him afterwards.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that when our daughters are coming to campus, when our children are coming to campus with these ideas, that's the baggage when they're starting to feel their boundaries are
Yes.
being violated. It's, ooh,
Oh my
my dad would
God.
be angry if I ran out on this argument. Aren't relationships hard? Aren't they work? Aren't I supposed to be working at it?
Wow.
And so that's a lot of what's in that essay is think about what we can do at home, what we can do to make it so that sexual violence just feels abnormal to
Mhm.
our children. That's one of the things that makes sexual assault on college campuses kind of hard to study is a lot of people don't realize they were sexually assaulted until after they've graduated because it all feels normal. It's not that different from what they experienced at home, right? So that's a
Mhm.
lot of it. And then the other piece is the end of that essay has just a list of questions you can ask your child's school to
Ah,
say, here's how we promote change. Here's the list of things, because it's the school that has the capability to protect themselves. Sexual assault is not the fault of victims. Victims do have some capacity to resist along this time that we're talking about,
yeah.
but it's the school that has the capacity to remove people who are known to be ideologically violent, who are known to engage in this type of violence, who are known to have a threat. And that would make the biggest difference. And as well as things like supporting survivors after violence does happen. That's something that you can ask your schools to do too. Every school should have a victim advocacy office.
Mhm.
Call your school, call your kid's school, let them know that they need a confidential victim advocacy office. So that's my one piece of advice. The other way I want to answer this is just through saying, if you've experienced a sexual assault and that's the scenario you're in, it's no longer a what if hypothetical, but it has
Right.
happened and you don't know what to do. I will say, again, go to a confidential rape crisis counselor. That can be on your college campus or any of the 24-hour hotlines. There are 24-hour hotlines that are free across the country. If you want to find one for your state or see the options in your city, Google the name of your state Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and you'll talk to someone who has a crisis counselor certification who can just walk you through all of the options that you are interested in learning about. That if you don't know anything, I used to
Mhm.
be an operator on one of these lines. Sometimes people would call and say, I don't know anything. What just happened to me? What can I do about it? Like that is a situation that everyone is trained and prepared for. And they are community specific. So they will be able to connect you with organizations in your community that might be the right fit for you or might be able to help you for a little bit and you'll pass on, whatever it might be. It is a trial and error process. And then the other thing I'll say is you deserve the right to privacy. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot since Me Too went viral, which is that you don't have to tell your story to everybody to get help. And the
Yeah.
people who insist on hearing it, that is a red flag. You should get to tell it if you want to. People should be willing to hear it. But the people who want to adjudicate it and want to figure it out, those aren't your people. You should be able to get support in whatever way you need without having to tell anybody anything. And that's true when you're calling any of these crisis numbers, and it's true with your friends and family. Find the people who are just willing to help you, and you don't have to convince them of anything. Those people will help you the most.
Thank you, Nicole.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you
you
for
for
having
that.
me.
Yeah. And thank you for writing this. Thank you for writing this book. Again, everybody, it's called On the Wrong Side: How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. Nicole, well done. Thank you for
Thank
doing the work
you.
that you do. And thank you for coming on to talk to us about this.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I said it earlier. At the end of reading this book, I wanted to punch somebody in the face. I still do. Because I really hate that so many people who are in vulnerable situations are not being helped, and not just that, are being taken advantage of, and that the people that hurt them and did the injustice to them are being protected. And that just makes me crazy. But all that said, I would not change at all that I read this book. I would not change it at all, because this is important information. There's so much in here that I did not know about. I had no idea about. All of this information is important to know, whether you've been assaulted or not, whether you're male or female or non-binary or however you identify, whether you have children, whether you don't, whatever. Everyone needs to read this book. It is so important. Read the book.
On page 233, Title IX is written out. It reads, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. That's Title IX. A page further, on page 234, Nicole says, over the past decade, we have treated Title IX system like a balancing act. It has become normal to suggest that violating a survivor's rights is acceptable, so long as it's done for the benefit of their perpetrator. But it isn't acceptable. It's a second act of violence. It shouldn't be radical to suggest that a functioning Title IX system wouldn't damage a survivor's education. It's quite literally the letter of the law, and still, if we were to imagine a Title IX system that treated a survivor's education as a top priority, it would undoubtedly look completely different from the Title IX system most, if not all, universities have crafted for their students.
Mm-hmm.
Top priority. If we treated the survivor's education as a top priority.
Yeah.
Title IX. This book is an important piece of work. I really feel grateful for the final words of hope and joy, because I do feel like Nicole has visioned a different, Nicole and her partner, and I forget her partner's name.
Jackie, I think.
Jackie. Nicole
Yeah.
and Jackie have envisioned a new way, a
Yeah.
different way, a better way. Let's follow that vision. If you know anyone in education, anyone with power, anyone who should be reading this book, get this book to them.
Yeah. And study what's been done in California. She goes into what California has done to put into practice a better way. This is not impossible. This is not hopeless. It's infuriating, for sure. Absolutely.
It is infuriating.
But there is hope. Please read Nicole's book, pass it along to other people.
And start visioning the change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks everyone for listening today. We will be back with more Madness Cafe next week. You can find us on Instagram at Madness Cafe Podcast, or email us at madnesscafepodcast@gmail.com. Bye.